Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the second video of the Project Maple Leaf series. If you didn't watch the first one, you might want to head on over there, check that out, where we talked about the front axle and our choice. In this video, we're going to talk about the rear axle and why we chose it. So check it out. So here it is in all its beefiness, the corporate 14 bolt. Now, there's a few different axles that were all 14 bolt axles. They made it for a lot of years. There were a lot of different configurations. So the one you're gonna wanna look for, the one that has the most aftermarket support and will go underneath a JK the easiest, is gonna be a 14 bolt referred to as the corporate 14 bolt, from a 99 to a 2006 GM 2500 to 3500 single rear wheel pickup truck. Blech. God, it was a mouthful. But that's the axle because the width is close to correct. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And there are just a bunch of different 14 bolts. Some of them were semi-float, not full float like this one. Some of them also had a smaller ring gear than a 10.5, which the corporate has. Some of them even had an 11.5-inch ring gear, but they have a different pinion design. And to be honest, an 11.5-inch ring gear is so large, it's just not necessary for off-road. There are plenty of people out there, rock bouncers, guys like that, that run these 14 bolts making 1,000 horsepower with stock axle shafts. So you guys don't even have to go to something like that. Now, because there are so many different 14 bolts on the market, the easiest way to identify your 14 bolt and make sure that the axle you're looking at on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or wherever you found it is in fact a 14 bolt. Just count the amount of bolts around the diff cover. There should be 14. After that, you're going to want to take a look at the bottom or the top of the diff, and you're going to notice that there's like cooling fins on the bottom and the top of the differential. That means it is that 9906 newer style, and you can also confirm that by going down here and looking at the pinion. The pinion actually is in its own carrier that bolts to the front of the housing with a bunch of bolts that all go all the way around. The 11.5-inch commonly referred to as the AAM, which can also be confusing because AAM is the same company that made the corporate 14 bolt. But the 11.5-inch ring gear 14 bolt will not have that pinion that unbolts from the front, so you can very easily tell what you're looking at. All right, like we talked about in video number 1, where we mentioned the benefits of having the Super Duty Dana 60, a lot of those benefits are the same with the 14 bolt, being that it was a fleet vehicle. So the aftermarket and factory support, the ability to get parts from an auto parts store, brakes, bearings, things like that are all readily available because it was just used by so many vehicles for so long. Now, they do come with drum brakes sometimes. I would try to find one that has disc brakes, but if you do find one with drum brakes, it's not the end of the world because they make kits and they're very, very easily swapped over. Now, obviously a common concern when you're putting bigger axles into a vehicle is how to make the brakes work. I'm gonna go over that in other videos in more detail and show you exactly, but similar to the Super Duty axle, the brakes are big. They're big because this came out of a heavy duty truck meant to haul and carry a lot of weight. So that's the way they're set up. Now, it also has an emergency brake in here, similar to the one that would have come standard on your JK, as far as it being inside of a drum that's made into the brake rotor. The cables are different, but Fusion 4x4, who also makes 1-ton axles that you can just bolt right in, makes a cable kit that adapts the JK lever to the 14 bolt, and they're not even all that expensive. So this is just a very easy axle to swap in with tons of support, like I said a minute. Another one of the benefits to this axle is how easily it is re-geared, okay? The 14 bolt axle inside, when you remove the carrier, actually has barrel adjusters on either side, so you don't have to wind up putting shims into your axle. So it's just a very easy axle. Even if you've never done a re-gear before, it's an awesome axle to start and make it your first to learn. Same thing with the pinion. Setting pinion depth and things like that are very simple because the pinion is in its own carrier, and that also is a strength. because while the pinion is in its own carrier and can be removed on its own and set up on its own without affecting the setup of the ring gear, the pinion also on the front of the pinion, unlike standard pinions, right? Standard pinions have a smooth top on them right by the pinion gear like this one does. Well, the 14 bolt pinion has a nub on the end of it that actually sits in another bearing. So it's supported on both sides of the pinion, which prevents all sorts of pinion deflection, and it's why they can also handle so much power. The full float axle shaft is also a lot stronger because it's not only driving the wheels and tires, but it doesn't support the weight of the vehicle at all, like a Dana 44 axle shaft would on your JK. Now, the other thing about the axle shafts, and it's something that a lot of people kind of shake their head or scratch their head over, is the fact that they're only 30 spline, right? A Rubicon Dana 44 is at least 32 spline. But you got to remember, these axle shafts are enormous. They have 1.5 inches diameter, and the splines are cut in a shape and size that make it super strong. So like I said a couple of minutes ago, there are often Jeeps that are V8 swapped running stock axle shafts in this rig on aired down tires bouncing off road, and they don't even break them. They are super strong in factory form. Lockers. It's always a big thing, right? You're upgrading, you're putting 1 tons under your rig, you got to run a locker. Well, I said before that the Dana 60 had a lot of options, right? E-lockers, air lockers, lunchbox lockers. The 14 bolt doesn't have quite as many options. There are no E-lockers at the point I'm making this video for a 14 bolt. So you have to run air or a limited slip style rear end. Now, depending upon the year of your Jeep, if you have a 13 and newer, your electronics for wheel speed sensors and skid control don't do so well with the limited slip style options, okay? There are some really strong ones out there, but if you have a newer JK, that would not be something that you'd want to go with just for ease of drivability. So air typically is the only option left. This has a 10.5-inch ring gear. We talked about the pinion and its strengths, and it's super strong. But the deepest gear ratio you can get for this 14 bolt, again, at the time of this video, is a 538. So we had said in the other video with the Super Duty 60 that a lot of Toyota guys like to run that axle, and they like to run Dana 60s in general, even when they're not from a Super Duty. Because Dana 60s, like I had said in the last video, can be geared all the way to a 717, which allows that gear to be able to move vehicles that have lower horsepower, while the 14 bolt can only go to a 538. So if you're looking to run a steeper gear than a 538 and you have a Super Duty Dana 60, that 14 bolt is probably not the one for you. Another really awesome benefit of running the 14 bolt as opposed to some other rear axles like a Sterling, right? Now, for those of you that don't know, the Sterling would be the rear axle out of those Ford Super Duties where we got our front axle. They're pretty easy to find, especially as a pair, because they come out of the same vehicle. The 14 bolt is a benefit over that axle because of the pinion location on the front of this case. On the Sterling, the pinion is positioned a little bit closer to the passenger side, and when you flex the vehicle, it winds up contacting the JK gas tank. Now, there are workarounds around that, but the 14 bolt is a really super easy axle to re-gear, and I don't have that issue. I don't have that workaround. I don't have that added expense of dealing with the JK gas tank. So 14 bolt it is. And the final thing that I am sure most of you guys are scratching your heads about and want to know the answers to is electronics. Obviously, we know that the JK, the old war paint back there, and even Maple Leaf have pretty sensitive traction control, skid control, and wheel speed sensors. Well, the 14 bolt actually doesn't even have a tone ring on it for your wheel speed sensors. So there's a kit, you can install them, we can work around that. I will show you how to do that when it comes time to build that axle. The front axle has a 60-tooth tone ring, factory inside the sealed hub bearing of the Super Duty Dana 60. Now, the Jeep reads a 52-tooth tone ring, and it doesn't matter what year JK you have. From 07 to when they last made them in 18, that all reads a 52 tooth. So the 60 tooth is what you're going to want to go with to make it the easiest and still be able to run those factory hub bearings on the Super Duty. But you just have to reprogram the computer. There's some workarounds around it. There's even wheel speed sensors that just plug right into the Ford and then plug right into your Mopar harness. So it's pretty easy to do, but again, I'm going to talk about that when we get into the nitty gritty of actually building these axles and getting them under the rig. So stay tuned. And guys, there you have it, right? The 14 bolt and pretty much all of its benefits, and certainly the reason why we chose to use it over the Sterling and the Super Duty Dana 60 in video 1. If you haven't seen that, go check it out.